almost nobody gets out of bed and goes, you know what, I'm going to do a shit job today. We already are strategic. We're just doing a really bad job of marketing it. Flexibility without structure can result in some of these real pain points and like hamper your ability to deliver this killer product.
Welcome, Matt, and congratulations on making the final 12 of the HR Influence Awards for 2026. What a great achievement among so many worthy and well-rounded nominees. Well done, and thank you for joining me today.
Mate, I appreciate it. Thank you firstly for the acknowledgement. Certainly was not expected, but much appreciated, and amazing to be, amongst some pretty incredible company, might I add as well.
Absolutely. So for those who don't know Matt is the founder and director of FNDN. We'll find out what that stands for shortly, and is Favicon's number 4 HR influencer in Australia for 2025 and a LinkedIn top voice. He founded FNDN, a compensation consulting practice for the startup and high growth tech sector, hosts the FNDN Series podcast, and co-organised the inaugural Startup People Summit 2025 with over 45 speakers. So you're not a stranger to any of this. So really excited to have you here today.
Mate, me too. Let's see how much we can cram in.
Let's kick off. So Matt, tell us about your career. How did you go from having an interest in studying psychology at university to becoming one of Australia's most recognised voices in HR and compensation?
Yeah, it's certainly not a clear path. I think the start of my career, and in fact, even my studies, really came from a lot of like, I don't know what to do. I did psychology quite literally just because I enjoyed it as a subject in high school, and I didn't really have like a strong passion for anything else that I wanted to pursue. And then at the end of psychology, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do. And it was actually, and I still to this day can't remember who it was that mentioned it to me, but they were like, oh, someone who worked in business, and they were like, oh, look, a lot of psychologists that I know of head into the HR profession. I wasn't really that interested in being a psychologist, counseling, or, I like to joke that I didn't want to listen to people's problems all day, but then I ended up pursuing a profession where I kind of did that anyways. Yeah, without really any other direction and no other focus, I decided to, learn a bit more about HR. Liked what I heard, liked the sound of things like organizational psychology and just understanding how you can leverage that to really enable workforces. And that was kind of what set the direction for me from a career perspective. And yeah, moved around. I moved up to Brisbane after finishing my degree. Got a job as an office administrator. I literally was like, I couldn't get a job getting into HR at all. It was really hard getting an entry level role. So I got some really sage advice from a recruiter at the time who said, look, just get some experience in an office doing administrative stuff, and it's going to be pretty close to what you're trying to do anyway. And that ended up working out really well. So I had an admin job for 12 months. And then straight after that, managed to get my foothold into a HR role. And then that was, that kind of set the scene for my career. My career has been pretty straightforward. I've been like a HR generalist, people operations, I guess, as a focus for most of that time across a range of different industries, legal, professional services, manufacturing, all sorts. But where I ended up spending a lot of my time and ultimately kind of falling in love with a little bit was that high growth tech space and, SaaS companies. I think in particular, like growing ones, you kind of have this opportunity to really put your fingerprints on a company and build some of these formative things that they've not had before. I just love that. I love the greenfields kind of environment. And yeah, that was been most of my career until a couple of years ago when I kind of just felt ready to do my own thing. I'd kind of always in the back of my head, I wanted to be my own boss and start something. I think a lot of that kind of entrepreneurial career gets really romanticized, and I was very much someone who was keen to do that. No, not a technical bone in my body, so it was never going to be as with a technology company. Although these days anyone can do that, can't they? And so, yeah, I kind of really sat down and just thought deeply about what it is that I loved about what I did, and came away with a bit of a short list. At the top of that list was remuneration compensation. A lot of people ask me why. It's just always been a part of my role, no matter which job I had in each of the each of the companies that I worked in. It was kind of there, right? Like someone had to own it. There wasn't a dedicated person, or if there was, I was kind of working closely with them, and it just kind of gave me this opportunity to experience it in a way that I think seems to be more rare for most HR professionals. And then at the time, like the last role that I was working in was a company called Oyster, and we had the chance to build that people function, and in particular its compensation function, while scaling from like 200 people to 600 people across 70 countries. And that for me just it was like the cherry on top of compensation. I was like, okay, this is the most extreme I'm probably ever going to see it. And so, yeah, just it was something that I really enjoyed. Ironically, I was getting a lot of questions from my network at the time. How do we handle compensation in one country, let alone 70? How do we tackle that? And so without much more direction than I like it, and there seems to be a lot of need for it, I kind of decided to kick off my own business. And so that's what Foundation, FNDN, that's what that stands for, is all about, is helping these startup organizations or scale up organizations build their first compensation foundation. So the things that are going to help them grow and scale without it being, the headache that pay can become, and enable them to be more efficient, more effective, all those sorts of things. So that was, hopefully an abridged version of how I got from there to here.
Oh, that's great. I love that you're focusing on the startup space too, because I don't know from your experience, but having a startup myself in the tech industry, it's really interesting because I think HR is really overlooked in the early phases of growth, early phases of a startup. I remember when I was raising money, seed money at the start, and I had a HR person who actually is still with us today. In the early days, she was only with us for 2 days a week. I'll never forget the investor said to me, why do you have a HR person so early in the piece? And I said, well, we're dealing with people setting the foundations from, role descriptions and performance reviews to remuneration to all of those things, right? Do you find that in the early phases, founders are quite surprised about how much HR burden there is in their businesses and how much it actually influences the direction of the company?
I mean, I think naturally there's a real trend for tech companies to like be a little bit anti-HR. I think it matters more so when you're a HR tech product, like Compono is. I think it's even more important to have that kind of person be not only an advocate for progressive people practices internally, but also for how that shows up in the product as well. I would say really where I see a lot of companies or struggle possibly with the absence of a HR person in their growth is when they start to introduce their sort of first level of leadership. So their first managers, that sort of thing. And you're kind of starting to separate the founder who has usually a very like tight idea around what that vision is and the culture, because it's often a reflection of them, how that should show up in their interactions with their people and their organization. But once you start to introduce that level of leadership, you really start to need to be able to telegraph that. And I think that's where some of the companies that I have seen or have worked with have really struggled with not having, I guess, a HR presence to come in and support that. And I think contrary is that companies that have introduced that support early on have been able to kind of move through that level of scaling much more easily.
So you've built FNDN Foundation, you've got the podcast, you've got the Startup People Summit that kicked off last year, a lot happening. So what is driving all that energy, right? Because you touch on a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit there. Is that what's driving it? Keen to understand how they all come together in terms of your vision. So what's driving that?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously know what drove Foundation. I think there was just a really strong need there from a compensation support perspective. And I think it was not one that was necessarily well addressed by the more traditional kind of big consulting companies. The reason for the podcast and the newsletter was really because I guess my approach towards building business and building relationships when I first started Foundation was to very much like build trust, be kind of like value forward, make sure that the people that I was speaking to sort of saw me as someone that they could trust and rely on if they needed help with what they were doing. And so they got a point where I was like, okay, I'm talking about this a lot on LinkedIn and I'm doing this from like my experience and sharing things that I've experienced with respect to building compensation structures. but I know there's a lot of great companies out there that are doing incredible things too. And I really wanted to platform them and kind of broaden the conversation. Certainly when I first started that, it didn't feel like there was a lot of great discussion around how pay worked. And that for me needed to be the first step towards helping in general, the level as a profession kind of lift, and for all of us to understand how pay can work effectively for our businesses, how it can be done fairly, competitively, all those sorts of things. I mean, that was really what the newsletter and the podcast was for, was like, how can we platform these incredible voices? How can we showcase the things that they're doing and yeah, elevate all of us, in the meantime. So there was that one. And then really Startup People Summit was kind of an extension for that. To be honest, like I actually really just got so fed up with the lack of, conferences or opportunities to learn from others in the startup space how to build great people functions. I think because my career has traditionally been quite global, I've had the incredible opportunity to be at some of these global conferences like Transform and some of these other really big names. But we've never really had anything in the APAC region that's kind of been for us. It's never really been something that could, where we can represent the great things that are happening in the Australian and New Zealand and APAC space more generally from a HR profession. And so, I think for years, and this is obviously how I know Tamara from Component, is like, I reached out when I was living in Brisbane and I was like, hey, there's only a few of us. Shall we all, get together and just get a drink and talk about how things are going? And through those conversations, I was like, well, where are you guys looking for influence or insights or whatever? And again, all of these examples were abroad. There was nothing in the region that we were really using. And so I was like, okay, it's time to be the change you want to see, and decided to kick off Startup People Summit last year. So it was, it was a massive undertaking. And I think if ever I've been someone who has, been more of a definition of the word scope creep, then that would be it. Like I kind of came into it with this really simplistic idea, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until it got to the point that it was, 45 speakers and hundreds of attendees. But it was incredible. It was an amazing success. And really looking forward to 2026 and beyond with that vehicle for sure.
Sounds like you've got a real desire to lift other people up, right? Like I'm listening to you talking about what you're doing, your brand, or catching up with strangers and to set up a conference. I think there's a real desire there. So, what's the one thing in your work right now that you're most excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think just generally we're at a point in the people profession where it's from my perspective, it's never been a better time to be in this space. I think we've seen such a maturation of the function over the last few years. I think, we've helped as a profession, we've helped organizations navigate some of the most challenging times ever, right? Like we saw COVID, where we were all having to make these adjustments for what we thought was going to be a really tragic coming future. And then all of a sudden things flipped around, the economy went crazy and we had to help scale enormously. We of course then saw many things happen in between there and then kind of a cooling down the other side. But I mean, the role itself has just evolved enormously. I think the sentiment that we're a more commercial function seems to have been more established over the last few years, which is incredible. And then I feel like I talk about this all the time, but I'm so bullish on it. I just genuinely think that AI is the thing that's really going to help us level up even more as a profession and as a function. And so I think just generally it's a really exciting space to be in. I think we've never been more important to organizations and their success. Organizations have never recognized that more than they do now. And so, we've got some incredible opportunities. We've got some incredible tools at our disposal. So that's the thing I'm excited about.
I agree. I think AI for HR gives them a real opportunity. And for me, what I'm seeing is, HR now more than ever have such a huge bank of data.
Mm.
And HR people typically aren't, data analysts. And so I think with AI, it can really help the HR function, HR people to understand trends, to make better recommendations rather than just being seen as the police. Is that what you're alluding to? Is that what you're seeing as well? Or have you noticed something else as well?
No, I would agree. I think our ability to pull, what is now a pretty substantial amount of data from various different systems to not only pull it together into, one common sort of framework, or pull disparate data points together to make or understand something better, that opportunity's never been better than it has been now. I think the gap to get there is a lot smaller now. Like, again, you still need to have a human in the loop, and by no means should AI be replacing decision making. But your ability to go from like, hey, I've got 3 spreadsheets here, can you help me make sense of the data, and I'm looking for this, like that can now happen so quickly. And I think it's enabled teams to not only make sense of things that they didn't think about before, but also, again, that analytical piece that you mentioned, they can get that speed to decision is so much faster now. And I think, again, that's helping them be, seen as a more commercial leader within the space.
So earlier you mentioned about working at Oyster HR, 600 personnel over 70 countries, I think you mentioned. What did that experience teach you about how different cultures think about pay and fairness and just generally cultural differences?
Yeah, it was, we'd almost have to record a whole other podcast on this one. I think I think what it taught me is that you, and this is just like wisdom that I think equally applies to anything in the people profession, is that you can't like make assumptions about how things should work. You really have to intimately understand the needs of your people. You have to understand how things that you might have otherwise wanted to be the same need to be differentiated, all those sorts of things, because of, again, the cultural nuance that exists across these different regions. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that you really have to genuinely understand your people and understand their needs to make sure that things are fit for purpose, rather than just going, oh, well, we've got people in 70 countries, it is what it is, like we're just going to have to roll it out and hope it's going to be successful. So that was definitely a learning. Yeah, from a change management perspective, it certainly ups the ante there by all means.
So you mentioned your ICP or your customer profile is that focusing on startups, high growth tech. What's the most common or biggest mistake you see startup founders make when it comes to pay, when it comes to HR? What's that one thing that keeps coming back to you?
Yeah, I think it would be from a compensation perspective, I think it's that there's like one perfect number that kind of exists that, solves all problems when it comes to compensation. And so often, I spend my time working with organizations, helping them recognize that actually often it's very little to do with the number. And it's kind of more to do with how the number is arrived at, how it's explained, how it's communicated, how people receive it and understand it, and how they do that in relation to others around them as well. It's all of those sorts of things that are the most important part of what it is that we do. And I think that really can be challenging, because, when you are a high growth startup, you're really just you're trying to be able to kill a product and you're trying to get it out. And so, when you're trying to hire someone and they say they want 150K, you're just like, yeah, cool, there's 150K. Like, off we go. Let's go build this product. Not realizing that by being as unstructured at the front of that process as as you might be, because you think it's the one that's going to help you get to that solution fastest, you're actually kind of embedding all of this like people debt that is just going to rear its head further down the line, because inevitably someone else is going to say, actually, I really like 170. And now suddenly we've got 2 people doing the same job being paid drastically different amounts of money that, inevitably we'll start to find that out about each other. So I think just by being really clear up front what those sorts of things need to look like from a salary perspective, recognizing that often flexibility without structure, can result in some of these real pain points, and can actually hamper your ability to deliver this killer product and roll it out later on down the line. So I think recognizing that actually we just need to do some formative thinking about what our pay structures should look like and get them in place, not in a way that's prohibitive to hiring or retaining people, but it is going to actually be one of those things where it's like it helps us go faster further down the line.
So I think a lot of what you're talking about is, systems and processes, communication, line of sight. To me, that also ties back to being very clear of what your culture is today versus what you want your culture to be as you grow. So from your experience in the space, what does building culture mean to you? So not the textbook answer, but in practice.
Yeah, I think it's for me, it's really getting clear about how systems and habits show up at work. I'll use an example. So a lot of companies focus on, their sort of vision, mission, values, and what they aspire towards. A lot of companies don't sit down and go, okay, well, if these are the values we expect to see, and maybe these are the behaviors or ways in which we expect them to show up, what's the opposite of that? Like, what are the ways that we don't want them to rear their head? And I think getting to that level of clarity and again, involving the team, like you've got people who also know what great looks like at your company and how to build successful outcomes, like involve them in that process, and rather than taking necessarily a top-down approach and making feel like it's being imposed on them. But for me, it's how can you think about the ways in which that shows up? So not just defining what good looks like and what bad looks like, but like actually understanding how we as a team bring that to life in the practices that we live and breathe every day.
It's the how we do things around here, right? And
Yeah.
although I'm not necessarily a huge fan of Kanye West, but he does have a great lyric, which is, everything I'm not made me everything I am.
Yeah.
It talks to essentially what you're talking about. What are we willing to not accept, and what are we, and how do we actually define who we are and what we stand for? So I love that. So, in terms of, in your experience, when a company's culture is not aligned with its strategy, what's the early warning signals people leaders should watch out for in your experience?
I mean, I think it'll come up. Like, I think it's the thing that companies unfortunately are very good at ignoring a lot of the time is like the qualitative data that exists, and the fact that often people will flag this stuff conversationally and not to look for it in a dashboard, not to look for it as a turn. Like, by the time you've seen turnover, it's too late. These people have walked out the door. You've lost that knowledge. You're having to replace them. You're bearing the cost of all those sorts of things. I really think like your listening as an organization needs to be on point. And it doesn't have to be always something that's done from a system perspective. It can really just be something as simple as like understanding what some of the undertone and the undercurrent of conversation is with your people, and making sure that you are consciously gathering that. You're actually asking questions, and you're making sure that that you are staying true to what that culture is and what you're trying to achieve.
So you mentioned turnover. I'm asking everybody on these recordings, have you ever made a bad hire, and what did it teach you about people and culture?
It's like bad hire is such a challenging term. I would say I've hired people that you know, I've either misled or, have had circumstances arise where, they could no longer kind of fulfill the needs of the role, things like that. I don't know. Bad hire is it can be such a broad term. What was the second part of the question? Sorry.
What did it teach you about people and culture?
What did it teach me about them? I think it's that we often it just comes down to miscommunication. Like, I think that tends to be 9 times out of 10. I think that's the reason for why people, quote unquote, have a bad hire, is that nobody gets out of bed. Almost nobody gets out of bed and goes, you know what? I'm going to do a shit job today. Like, these people don't really exist. People want to come to work. They want to be productive. They want to have a purpose. They want to enjoy the company of the people they're working with. And often it comes from a lack of understanding around what it is that we're trying to achieve, or how it is that we have to achieve it, or any of those sorts of things that kind of tends to result in someone being, ultimately labeled a bad hire from my perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the research also states that, companies that are really good at providing realistic job previews or realistic previews, they tend to retain staff a lot longer, and, it works out in the long run. I think one thing that in my career that I've noticed is missing, you can still have a realistic preview, but by and large, people leave leaders as opposed to leave jobs or leave organizations. So I think there's probably a bit of a gap that I still think there is in the recruitment space, which is, nobody works in a vacuum. They're going to be
Mm.
joining a team. How do they fit within the team? And then, how do they align with the leader? How do they align with the manager? Is there going to be natural conflicts? Is there going to be natural misalignment or alignment? And being able to provide that two-way insight to the leader as well as the talent, I think that is really important. And I think that's something that we haven't quite nailed yet. So in terms of, if I think about people leaders in general, what advice do you have for them in terms of dealing with, team members with different preferences, different personalities? How can we go about making that more of a spoken topic and better understanding amongst team members and leaders?
Think that when it comes to understanding, everyone's kind of unique essence and what they bring to the role, to the company, or how they kind of navigate one another better. The first step for me is always like acknowledgement, right? Like that's the old kind of Alcoholics Anonymous sort of thing, right? Like acknowledging you have a problem first. Maybe it's like a bad label for it, but it's like you have to firstly actually stop and recognize, okay, well, who are we as people? How do we actually define our preferences in terms of ways of work or whatever it might be? And how do we document them? And how do we start to like create a bit of conversation and a bit of awareness about them amongst one another? I mean, it's a big step for a company to have a culture where people can be comfortable sharing those sorts of things. So I think it has to be probably done in moderation. I know I would certainly in some companies I've worked for have a bit of baggage or be a bit reluctant about sharing those sorts of things. But the more in particular, I think a leader can share themselves and be upfront with the team about themselves, like lead by example, the more likely they are to create the safety and the space for their team to do the same.
Fantastic advice, right? I think the saying of a fish starts rotting at its head is really apt here, right? So
Yeah,
it's got to come from the leader, it's got to lead from the top.
absolutely.
So I agree. So thinking now a little bit about the people function, what advice would you give? Not just startups, not just growth companies, but general people function, how to move to be more that strategic partner across the business, not just, that traditional view of transactional being the
Mm.
police of policies and procedure. How do we actually navigate that becoming more strategic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, one of the things I talk a lot about in the various different forums and channels that I speak is I think often we are very bad at actually branding ourselves as a function. So I won't talk about how, everything we do has to connect to the bottom line. I think that's probably been talked to death. And if people teams don't know how to do that already, then that's probably the first problem. But the second one is that often we're not being clear with the business about what it is that we're here to achieve. So what I mean by that, everyone knows who Toby from The Office is. He's kind of this like, classic representation of the HR function. He kind of sits in his back office. He only pops up when it's time for the, mandatory training. He's only called in when there's a problem. Now, I don't know how many people have watched The Office, but I'm sure that they've probably seen more of that or more of some kind of representation of HR than they have maybe seen of HR themselves. And so you've got to think like, well, what are people's expectations about what HR is and what it's there for? And unfortunately, this kind of like popular culture is often what sets people's assumptions around what it is that we do. So they're already conditioned to believe that we're terrible, we're not their friend, we're not to be trusted, all these sorts of things. And here we are, and 9 times out of 10, teams don't do a great job of actually broadcasting what it is that they're there to accomplish themselves. So I'm a really big advocate of going, okay, well, when we say HR, what are we actually here for as a team? So we help find the people that are going to enable us to deliver on our strategy, build our product, get it out the door, all those sorts of things. We help enable you through these various different systems and programs. How does that show up? What does that look like? But even down to like, why don't we as people teams share what it is that we're working on as well? And now, sure, you're obviously not about to go and start, open sourcing when you're doing an investigation or something like that. But it's an increasingly small part of the role. Like the stuff that people teams are doing now is strategic. It is, looking at dashboards or building dashboards. It is coming up with programs that meaningfully impact the way people do their work. Why don't we have a roadmap? Why aren't we telling people what we're working on? Again, don't let the business define what it is it thinks we do, and don't let them define what we do by coming to us and saying, hey, I've got this question of whatever, and suddenly it just derails the project that we're working on. Like I think we really need to do a better job of saying, here's actually what we are here to achieve. But much like my previous answer, here's what we're not, here's the things we don't do. And here's how that's showing up at work. If you want to engage with us because you have a question about something, a benefit or whatever, this is the forum in which to do it. But otherwise, we're spending our time building these projects and here's how they're going. Here's how they're launching. Do you want to be part of the pilot program? Like there's a way better way of doing this that I think would just drastically improve people's perception of the HR function and also help them understand that in many ways we already are strategic. We're just doing a really bad job of marketing it.
Love it. Honestly, I grew up believing that we're all salesmen,
Yeah,
right? Yes, we're not necessarily selling a product, or a widget, but we are selling ourselves. You're just really aware that you are doing it and know what you're doing and campaigning for yourself, or you're really unaware and just doing a terrible job at it. So I think, what I've noticed is HR people is really good at, coordinating and doing and auditing work, but not so great at that campaigning, that marketing, that selling themselves to see, is what I'm selling actually valuable and what my clients want? Or do I have to adapt that? And I think that what you've just said there really resonates with me, because we're all in sales. We're all selling ourselves all the time, every day, all day long. And I think we've got to really take stock of whether what we're selling is what our customers want. So yeah, beautifully put, Matt.
absolutely.
Last question, finally. If you could go back in time, what are the 3 pieces of advice you would give to your younger self about HR, work, people, or culture?
Yeah, gosh. This is the one I wish I'd prepared for. All right, so I'm just gonna rapid fire. So one is, I think in the past I've definitely been the idealistic HR person. I think sometimes, I think sometimes we suffer from this as a profession. We've let ideas of excellence or projects or things we needed to work on that weren't necessarily connected to how they could enable a business. And I think if I would go back and tell myself, it would be to let some of those go if they really couldn't prove the benefit and the value to the business. I think sometimes it's easy as a HR professional to get caught up on like best practices. So I think sometimes you just need to park those and go, okay, but they might be a best practice, but are they the best thing for the business? What's the second one? I wish, I wish I had learned more about like data analytics earlier. I think it's such an underrated skill set. It definitely felt like it was something that came to me more to like the later part of my career. But it's such a game changer. I think it's, I know we have AI, which I think has reduced the challenge of getting involved in something like that. But if you can't dig beneath AI and understand how it's come to the answer, then oh gosh, I've seen so many horror stories of people who are like, oh, I realized this dashboard that we built it's been feeding us the wrong information. So I think there's still such a huge need for that. And I wish, I see some of these other people on LinkedIn. I'm like, oh, I wish I knew how to do that. So I definitely would encourage myself to be more analytical. And I think that just builds the commerciality of the function. Now, what would be a third? Oh, it's a
Just
tricky
on that
one.
second point, I actually
Yeah.
really I value that too, and I think that has to be the next evolution of HR. Right,
Mm.
is yes, there's the understanding employment relations and industrial all that kind of stuff, but I do think it's becoming those data analysts, because I completely agree with you. So many times you see models, AI punching out numbers, and the younger generation, they never had to go do real number crunching, so they just believe it at face value. And I think your point being of having that deeper understanding up front is really valuable. So
Mm.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. Third point,
For
last
sure.
one.
Third point, last one. All right. So I think again, this is something I wish, I wish I was more of an advocate for myself as a HR professional. I think it's very easy for us as a profession to feel like we have to be impartial, even about ourselves and our own progression, our own development, what we're paid, all those sorts of things. I think that mindset needs to be parked. And again, I think this was something that felt like it came to me too late in my career. Eventually, I was a good advocate for myself. But yeah, I just think like you've got to go to bat for yourself, because it's a lonely job. It's only the best companies that I think about this for their people, professionals internally. And you spend all day thinking about everybody else, and I think you have to have that same headspace for yourself as well when it comes to the things that are important to you.
Smiling because it's beautiful, because this has kind of been the message across all of the interviews, and I think, we started the conversation of, what drives you, what motivates you, and a big part of it was lifting other people up. And to be honest, this has been the recurring theme with our awards is HR people's really good at celebrating others, lifting others up, but not so good at celebrating themselves, and I think we really wanted to change some of that through this Influence Award. So I'm really pumped that we could actually share it with you. But I think you're not alone. It seems to be a really common theme there. And, hopefully the award is a small step in the right direction, but looking forward to include you in some of the other stuff we're doing too, Matt, and celebrating you and celebrating the other cohort of winners. So hopefully we can change some of this.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thanks for making me be part of it.